The Southern Paiute people are a group of people who, it extends from the Las Vegas area over to southern Utah and borders on the Colorado River. But Southern Paiute people have had lots of research done on them. Kay Fowler is certainly somebody, the reference you see here, What's in a Name, Southern Paiute naming practice. Kay's always been interested in environmental perceptions and things to do with environmental management, which she's passed on to her students. That includes me. And so Kay also worked with a woman named Isabel Kelly, who did a lot of work in the 1920s and 1930s. And Kay is now publishing some of Kelly's notes on Southern Paiute people that she didn't get to before she passed away. So lots of work on those. But this idea of a sense of place and naming practice is so key to understanding for hunter-gatherer people in particular, because hunter-gatherer people don't build monuments. They don't have a Washington monument. They don't have, trail signs. They don't have, here's the marker, you're going into the Grand Canyon National Park. Traditionally, hunter-gatherers, their landscape's very subtle, and they don't leave a lot there, and so we tend to think of it as like, well, it's just kind of nothing, right? And so that idea of nomads, we're just kind of wandering around in the desert, just like, oh, I hope I'll get some food, maybe some water. That's not the way hunter-gatherers operate. All over the world, hunter-gatherer people name places, they name important places, and they create there is a physical manifestation of a cultural landscape. It's subtle. It could be the remnants of flaking or grinding stones on the ground, but you're not going to have a building, a huge monument. You don't have that kind of thing happening. You might have old house remnants that are there that are part of that cultural landscape, part of that built environment that people understand what it is. But you also have a name that actually translates to something, that when a child is learning that country and they're going around to the different places with their family and learning what's there, how to get it, where the water is, they're learning the names. And when they learn the names, they're learning not only what that spot is, what is available there, they're learning the history of that place, who's associated with that place, what kinds of events happen there, what kind of associations there are with religious events, with mythologies, with stories of creation. And so it's a mental cultural landscape in many ways, but just as vital as one that we tend to build in the West. We tend to build up. We like, concrete, and we build stuff. And that's often our idea. But think about what you do in your everyday life. It doesn't involve a map. You just kind of know where you're going, and you know that certain places in your life are important to you for different reasons. And it's not because it's a building or something. There's different reasons why that's important to you. And that's what we're looking at with this kind of practice. So these are sort of really important things to understand because they're vital to how they understand land. And it's also vital to contemporary consultation with Native groups. So often you'll get these conflicts between federal land managers and people who want to use federal lands for mining or exploration or whatever they're doing, building a dam or recreational sites, whatever they're up to. When Native Americans say, well, that's really important, and Western see nothing. There's nothing there. How could it be important? There's nothing there. And yet it is. And so to understand that what Western eyes don't see doesn't mean that Native eyes don't see that either. That's there. And you can't, as a Westerner as a Western person who's going to try to understand what Native people might see on that landscape, you have to try to bridge that gap, because it's important to bridge that gap, to say sometimes nothing means everything. And because nothing to us is like, well, it's just empty land, so there's nothing there. And yet when you have attached meanings to places, it's not empty. It's got all kinds of symbolic meanings. And so those are important things to remember when we go out and have to practice these kinds of things. And then the other thing too, it's just a glorious, wonderful way to see how people story a landscape. That landscapes are storied places, and they may not have features on them that we recognize as being super, you know, like, oh, okay. But, you know, a rock formation becomes X. A rock formation could be the lady at Pyramid Lake who's, you know, crying and creating the waters of Pyramid Lake. And when you look at the formation of that, you go, oh, you know, yeah, it does look like a lady that's sitting there. But to know the story behind that adds more significance to it than it just would if you just went, oh, it just looks like a lady. You know, that's like looking at a cloud going, I think that looks like a bunny, and not thinking twice about that. But these are things that matter, and it's pretty neat stuff. So Southern Paiute people live in hot desert lowlands around Las Vegas and over into eastern Utah. And Isabel Kelly worked in all those areas, you know, over into Utah and especially around the Las Vegas Pahrump area. And the thing is when you're in a very hot desert, water is a key resource wherever you are. All of us, we need water to survive, right? But when you're walking in territory and your territory is big and you're walking a lot and you have that kind of work to do, water is especially important. And you can survive without food for a few days. Not the same case without water, especially if you are sweating it out and all that. It can make a huge impact on you know, whether you're going to survive or not. So it's a huge thing. So is it imperative that people knew where every possible water source was? Absolutely. And did they know the nature of those water sources? Absolutely. So this is where that naming thing comes, you know, where you have this place name that's got codes in it that gives you a hint on what's going on. And then you learn that, and you learn the spatial configuration of all these places in your head. And, you know, it's kind of an amazing mental map that a person has of territory based on different kinds of place names. So, you know, not only did people have names for and sets of names for water sources, they also had networks of named trails between different spots. The translated names provide ecological clues for what's going on at those places. And also the thing about place names and why Isabel Kelly was certainly interested in, and certainly why Kay Fowler is interested in them, is that the naming practice and what is involved linguistically, which is a whole other area of study, provides clues to what people's environmental perception was, how do they perceive their environment. And of course, hunter-gatherer people, a lot of perception goes to what the environment actually is, because that is key to survival. But that also includes, you know, how are they designating different places? You know, like one of the things that I love, the naming practice doesn't get into this, but it's an environmental perception thing, is when you talk to certain people and they say, oh, it's just that over there, and they're pointing across this huge valley, and it's a tree, you know, and this happened to me in Australia. It's just over there, and I'm like, over there's miles away. And, you know, it's like, it's close up. You know, not really, you know. And this distance thing is different for me versus somebody who grew up in the bush. And so how you name the different features on the land is going to vary by different kinds of society. So when Kelly was doing her work in the 20s and 30s, she found that people in the Las Vegas and Pahrump territory, the people who were, you know, they were, you know, some of those people might have lived before contact was super significant, but not really. So a lot of this memory culture for these folks. But even then, with, you know, huge transformations with contact, 230 place names she collected for the Las Vegas Pahrump area. And that includes names for springs, both hot and cold, tanks. Tanks are just, you know, natural rock holes that can be big or small, that hold water after a rainstorm. Washes, streams, rivers. They also had names for camps where water was sufficient for planting corn. Historically, Southern Paiute people took up corn planting and incorporated it into their seasonal round. Basically planted corn, had some water going to it, kind of low level. They didn't stay there, and then they took off and went on their merry way to hunt and gather, and then came back when things were ready, and which was, you know, a great way to incorporate some horticulture into your system. They also had names for camps where one could not plant. And that actually shows the transformation of linguistic clues of what that is. So that you have different meanings encoded into words. They had names for mountain peaks, ranges, saddles, margins of valleys, knolls, hills, and plateaus. Islands and parts of islands were found in the Colorado River, which was nearby. Some valleys, especially if they had a characteristic kind of plant cover or a feature within it, trails and parts of trails, and of course various sacred sites. So Kelly found like 92 names for springs, 70 names for mountains, and the remaining 68 names labeled different kinds of geographic features. So that gives you some idea of what was important to people, and it is when you're moving across landscapes and you have to go. You kind of know how you need to know how that landscape is laid out, and it's pretty cool. So naming practice varies by language. That's not too surprising, is it? Southern Paiute language codes environmental details really in a few short syllables. And some of those details are short in both Southern Paiute and in English. For example, knoll, mountain, plateau. So you have a short syllable that's encoded in Southern Paiute language. Just really specific kinds of things. Others are long in English, but short syllables in Southern Paiute. So here you have the English translation, shaded slope of canyon wall. And I don't have the Southern Paiute translation for that because, well, I wouldn't know how to say it for starters. But you get the idea that there's going to be a short syllable in Southern Paiute for that whole term, because that's a lot of information, right? You know it's a canyon, you know it's a wall of a canyon, you know it's sloped and it's shaded. So which tells you a lot about what that place looks like. A spot of level ground surrounded by ridges. Rolling country intersected by several small ridges. But then that's where you're loading in so much environmental detail in just a few short syllables. And that makes the language very efficient at describing these topographical details. And so it shows this, accuracy and detailed topographic information that's embedded in Southern Paiute language. Because imagine if you were really going on a spot of level ground spotted by ridges near a shaded slope of a canyon wall by a spring that has willow by it, that grows red, and it would just get ridiculously hugely long if you had lots of words and syllables and sounds that coded that information. But you make it small in little packets of information, and so every single thing packs a punch in terms of the detailed topographical information. Because what could be one of the worst things that could happen to you as a hunter-gatherer would be not knowing where you're going on a landscape. That would be devastating, and that would lead to your death. Absolutely. So it's key to have topographical information because that is your map. You don't have a drawn map. You don't have a GPS unit. You have what's in your head and how to get around that landscape. And those are your keys to that. So Edward Sapir, who was a brilliant, brilliant linguist back in the time that Isabel Kelly was working too, collected data on noun formation processes. So these are the linguists for the Kaibab, Southern Paiute, and the references to topographic features. He found that in part of a word, very specific labels form parts of the nouns: ledge, sand flat, spot on level ground, canyon wall, all that stuff. Canyon wall receiving sunlight, which I love. That's the opposite of the shaded slope of the canyon wall. Rolling country intersected by small ridges. Each of these expressed in just a few syllables. And Sapir was, it's hard to describe. The guy was magnificently brilliant. He died young, which is unfortunate because he did some amazing work. And if he'd been able to continue on through his life, who knows what we would have learned. But what he concluded was that noun formation reflects the interest of people in specific environmental features. And so you've got that accurate reference to topography. And for him, it was like for people living in an inhospitable environment. But I think if he were like right now, he'd go, People that live in less hospitable environments will find that they have the same kind of detail as well. And, so for him, it was like a practical need of people to locate springs. And you might have to reference other topographic features to give people those clues on how to get there. Um, but also remember this: when you're learning Southern Paiute language and you're learning your country, your territory as a child, you're learning that all simultaneously. So it's coming into your consciousness not only as language and clues and people showing you all that stuff, of course, because they're gonna, and but you're learning it as you're doing it. And so it's not just some, a thing that you learn at camp. Well, you just go for 5 ridges and blah, 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 you'll get there. It's like, well, no, now we're going over these small ridges. And look, the rolling country. Look, it's intersected by all these small ridges, see? And kids are learning that as they go. And that's part of the totality of how you learn that landscape, if that makes sense. And so when we think about socialization and the training of children to operate in their own society, that's a big part of it. And it's something that people would take seriously, to train the kids on how to do that, and kids paying attention to that, because it is a key to survival in what is, a relatively harsh environment. And so, it's just a natural thing. You don't have room to be a snarky teenager who's going to go off to your room and pout and put on your headphones. If you're not paying attention to where the water is, because the other thing too is when you become an adult, and of the age where you can have children of your own, you have to make sure that your kids are going to survive, and you got to know this stuff for your kids to survive, to carry on the culture and carry on, your kids through the generations. You've got to know this stuff. You don't get to mess around with it. And so, unlike so many of the things we know these days, which you may choose not to know or you choose to know, wasn't necessarily a choice back then. So just in case you were thinking that all these things were all about topography and environment, that's not right. Springs were more than survival. They were highly symbolic. And they often included stories and songs that include the names of springs and other places. So they're part of this symbolic culture. Springs are places that were celebrating great hunts and other events, part of that history that's embedded in a place, that's encoded in that when you know the name of that place and you know the great hunts and other events that happen there. The moves, naming practice, it moves beyond denoting geographic space. So you've got embedding of names and places, of stories and history and people. And that becomes a storied landscape, a named and storied landscape. And in that, you create a sense of place and a sense of belonging. And here it comes, you guys. It's home. This is how you have a home. It's not just some wild territory that nobody else would want to use. It's home. And so when we hear contemporary Native people talking about this deep connection to land, and we hear this all the time, this is where this is coming from. This deep sense of Mother Earth and what that is, and how big that is, and how deep that connection is. And it's all of these things and all wrapped up into each other. And that's, if you think about that for 5 seconds, that's just kind of normal life. That's what we do. I can go to the house I grew up in as a kid, and out front there's a concrete line in front of the rock wall that there's a footprint from each of my brothers and myself in that concrete when my dad put that in and we slammed our feet into it. Of course, my brother's, Tim's, is the deepest because that's him. But that's the kind of stuff, we moved to a different house when I was a kid, and when I was up in Portland at Christmas one time, my parents had passed away and we'd sold the house, and my sister-in-law was like, "You want to go see the house?" I'm like, "Yeah." And came to the court where the house was, and the guy who bought it was out, and he came over to the car because he saw us like looking, and we introduced ourselves, and he was like, "Oh," and he was telling us the stuff that he had kept in the house. It was part of my history and some of the stuff he changed. And it was really cool, but that's my history with that place, and that'll never go away. You know, no matter what happens to that house, that's part of the embeddedness of my history and our stories, our family stories that go with that place. And that doesn't go away. That's just part of your cultural milieu. So a sense of place is a sense of home. So in terms of the naming practice, what we've been looking at is the development of toponyms, place naming practice, the toponyms, naming the topography of a landscape. If you look at maps, and I actually worked on Isabel Kelly's maps trying to figure out where she was, because sometimes she didn't document it so well. But looking at different maps, I'd looked at 15-minute maps, 100,000 scale maps, 250,000 scale maps. And you see the transformation of Native American names getting replaced by, or just being lost on maps, and then getting replaced by European names. The 100,000 scale maps seem to have the most Native names left on them. But you see, you know, all those spots that are named on any kind of map, map paper and drawings and all that are, you know, the Western notion, but this other practice for toponyms is something else. And so here's some examples of some translations of toponyms, which I just love. Dog water comes out. Rabbit trail water comes out. Cactus drinking place. Purple willow small water. I mean, they're so just like bam, shorthand almost. Willow standing in a row, water comes out. So water, 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 water. Kind of a huge place. Keith Basso, who wrote a book called Wisdom Sits in Places, he wrote so many articles on naming practice among the Western Apache. And in his studies of place names, he explains how naming systems imbue the landscape with meaning. Imbue the landscape with meaning. And the places are shot through with stories. And Apache people describe this like, it's shot through like an arrow. The story's in this place. Symbolically, it's there. And we know that. We do know that. It's just hard to see when it's a different society. They in turn reflect the stories to the users of that place. It's this circle of life, if you will. But it's a circle of cultural meaning where it's a place that holds these meanings even when nobody's there. But then when people come, and then that meaning comes to the people who then give it back. It's this, you know, great feedback system. They reflect on the events of history and who was there and add to it as time goes on, as they live in these different places. So it keeps track of long ago events. It's history. It may not be written, but it's an oral history. And it is written in the landscape in a way that it's those places that are pierced with that meaning. In that way it's written, but it's not written in words and in a book. But the book is across that land, and that's an amazing thing. And so you have all kinds of reference animals and birds and plants and bugs and people, you name it, geographic places. So it's really, you know, just such a key feature of all humans, but in particular looking at how Native people do this. And, you know, again, when we see the importance of water in southern Paiute land, yeah. And it's no accident that the people Isabel Kelly talked to remembered more of water places than other places. Now, some of you in class might be from Pahrump or Las Vegas or thereabouts, Amargosa, Beatty, somewhere around there. And Pahrump is rather famous for this translation, but this gives you an idea of like how specific it can be. So there's the example. Parimpi is the Southern Paiute term, and then you have the English version of it, Pahrump. So water rock, water again. So look, Pa. We also have a town called Tonopah. Pa means water. Rimpi, rock, rock. Hi, rock. Don't know where it is in Pahrump. Been there, but don't know where it is. But that shows you two things. Two parts of that word translate to that. And when you know that, if you know the meaning of what that is and where it is, you're going to know exactly where that spot is. Mind you, I don't know where it is. It's not the casino that I could find. But anyway, so that's, that's a great little example of all that. So one of the ways that people learn about places is through songs and stories, and it encodes all kinds of information and rules of behavior and things that you're supposed to do and the origins of the world, where it comes from. And oftentimes these songs and stories contain place names. And songs actually can chart actual journeys to those places. So a few examples: the deer song, the mountain sheep song, the salt song, the quail song. So the Southern Paiute deer song was sung for hunting, dances, funerals. Singers arrived in early morning and go through 200 verses. The singing lasts all night through morning, and it's a rich and detailed experience. The deer in this song cycle travels around the Charleston Range, which is outside of Pahrump, looking for food. The snow is deep, and it goes from place to place. And it starts way up on top of Charleston Peak. Then it comes through the snow and down the valley and comes through Joshua Tree Valley between the Charleston Range and Tule Springs. And they sing all of this in a song, and they name every place he stops, everything that he eats, kind of basically everything he does as he does this. And so that's a deer moving through this land, and there's all kinds of information that's embedded in that, not just environmental information, but also how you get around these places, where you go. Kelly gives 2 samples of parts of the deer song, and both parts name 3 places the deer stops. Hunters owned this song, and they could sing it in its entirety to others who needed luck or the lessons. So the lessons, that's an important thing there. So that's a lesson in terms of how this landscape is arranged and where this deer's stopping. And if you're a hunter and you own that song, then you have the right to sing that song and also to teach it to other people. So that's kind of, and owning a song, that's pretty cool. So you've got those names, but the salt song is something we're gonna, and you have a film on the salt song, which is pretty, it takes place outside of this area, but for other reasons, but you'll see that when you see the film. Hopefully you'll look at this before you actually see the film, because the film doesn't get into this kind of detail. It actually takes place at boarding schools, because the salt song is a funeral song, and lots of people never return home from the boarding schools. So the salt song details the travel of 2 sisters, and these sisters lived at a mountain between Searchlight and Fort Mojave in the desert. And they start their journey approximately at this red triangle here. Oh, I'm loath to try to circle it. And it covers a huge area, it really does. So the salt song is a funeral song, okay? But it also imparted tons of information about the landscape and traveling about that landscape. Listeners and singers alike could visualize the landscape, would know what lived there, would learn how to move about and what one would see and hear. It also fixed people to places, the living and the dead. It encodes histories into places. It maps country. Salt songs are sacred, and they describe physical and a spiritual landscape. Landmarks are described by the songs. At memorial events, singers are accompanied by dancers as they perform the 142 song cycle. It's a big business learning your landscape. That gives you a clue how big that is. From sunset to sunrise, to assist the deceased in their sacred journey. Lead singers guide the singers across the spiritual landscape to gather at Nuva Kion at midnight to assist the deceased in their crossing. A gentleman named Larry Eddy is, I'm like a bus driver, making sure that the singers visit all the right stops at the right times along the way. another dimension of the songs, according to Eddie. When the songs travel through the land of the different tribes, they call out to them in their own language, speaking in Paiute, Mojave, Shoshone, Hualapai, and Chuila. Is that, oh, come on, that's amazing. Um, I forgot to kind of point out these little arrows kind of track the song cycle, and you can see what a vast area it actually covers. It's huge. And so here's our birds, the wild goose and our unidentified water bird that are part of this story. So in these next several slides, I'm just going to show you some of the places where the song goes and where these two birds go, so that you can just get a kind of a sense of how big this is. So these, the travels of these two sisters, these two birds, the wild goose and the small water bird. I love that. The wild goose and the small water bird are sisters. And they lived at a mountain called Agai, springs and everything, and Agai is Newberry Mountain. There's a picture of it. Then the sisters traveled to Fort Mojave on the other side of the Colorado River. They crossed to the other shore at Fort Mojave and came up the river on the east side at a place called Moavit, which is a terrible picture, but it's what I could come up with. Then they crossed the Colorado at a junction of the Virgin River, so we're up towards like the Moapa area. They went up to a salt cave there and they named it, those two sisters. From there they went to Nuva Kiav, Mount Charleston, which is right outside of Las Vegas, where the Nuuvi people originate. Mount Charleston is a very prominent feature on the landscape down there. Really huge, and you can see it's got pine forest and all that, which is amazing because it's just sticking up out of this desert landscape, and it really is prominent, and it's beautiful. So these birds are flying all over the place. And then the two sisters go to Ash Meadows, which is one of my favorite places in the whole wide world. It's absolutely beautiful. It's near Pahrump. If you guys ever get the chance to go to there, it's a fish and wildlife site. It's got amazing interpretation, but it's just beautiful. Just an aside there. So they go to Ash Meadows, and who could blame them? It's got blue waters from hot waters, warm waters, I should say, that look like they have dye put in them. It's an oasis. It's amazing. Then they go to the salt lake below the town of Shoshone called I can't say that. HGH. How do you say an HGH? Panhoog. Then they went to Blythe and they crossed the river once more. So they're crossing the Colorado River a lot here. And they come up the east side, arriving just before daylight at Quinava. And they went into these mountains in the morning, and there's a large cave there, too, in fact, and they entered one of the caves. And so those are the kinds of stories that exist for this huge story, and there's way more, obviously. If you have 142 verses, you've got a lot more to say than what I have here. This example doesn't name the springs, but it's clear from Kelly's notes that springs are part of the oration, and thus springs and other places have symbolic meaning as well. Water itself is a sacred substance to the Southern Paiute, and it must be approached as a living thing, must be approached prayerfully. It has its own spirit, and there can be specific spirits that live in the springs and other sources. Some can be harmful to humans, so water must be approached with respect. That's a key feature of this whole idea of naming practice. When we think about what do you mean, how's this landscape symbolic? How does it have meaning beyond just pragmatic, there's water there? That's how it has meaning. You don't just run up there and, grab a drink. You approach it as a living thing, and that's something the term living water was one that I learned in Aboriginal Australia, that was spring waters or living waters, as opposed to something that collected in a rock bowl or a clay pan. Living waters were spring bubbling up from the ground, and living things, a living entity. that had its own, spirit. It had associations, and no, you did not just go up to it. So it's the same kind of thing. Springs are viewed as interconnected with water flowing in veins underneath the earth and emerging only occasionally. Doctors and other men of power could travel on these underground water trails, sorry. That's an amazing configuration of how you conceptualize a landscape like this. And in many ways, it's absolutely correct because it's groundwater. But to look at a living vein and have it pop up in different places is truly magnificently wonderful. And for each of those places, you don't approach it like, oh, I'm just going to get a cool drink and I dip my tin in here. It's all going to be good. And so when you see the Salt Song and you see, I'm going to have 2 of the movies loaded for you. But again, they're funeral songs and they're helping people get to the next place in life. And they take place in places that were way outside of people's traditional country, like Riverside, California, where many, many children died at boarding schools, or that they disappeared because they never came home. And it's a way to guide their spirits back to their country, back to their territory, back to their home, back to their, Southern Paiute homes. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so in case you didn't get it, placemaking is part of building a cultural landscape. Because hunter-gatherers left so little behind, it's hard to imagine that they did create cultural landscapes. It's very hard for Westerners to see that, but they did. And as children grew up in a territory, they learned the names and a mental map, places and the trails. They learned who was associated with these places, what ancestral figures created them, and on and on and on. And learning about these places continues today, and people are trying to recover what they know about these places, trying to map them out, trying to remember, trying to keep hold of that knowledge. And just because Western eyes can't see this doesn't mean it's not there. It is there. We just have to learn how it's there. And this should help you along that path. And one of the things when I did my work in Australia, I'll never forget this, the community I was working with had been evacuated because it was flooded. And when I went out to Kirikura, I told people I wasn't sure about what the turnoff was, and some of my Aboriginal consultants were like, it's because we haven't shown you that place yet. And when they did show me the place, and they said, okay, see that rock over there, that's blah blah, and that's over there, and that's so and so, and then there's the road. So then you get, I was like, oh, okay. And they really, only on just this minuscule level for me, trust me, super minuscule, but it helped me learn what the markers were. Like, okay, that's that, that's that. Okay, turn there. Okay, that's the stand where those are good spearwood sourced. It helped me learn how to navigate that landscape because the features are subtle. And and people would just make fun of me because I was constantly, losing track of where I was, and they'd see my tire tracks turning around and make fun of me in a fun way. But it was, but when they just said, we haven't shown you, and they'd laugh about people with their GPS units and their maps, and they just go, we'll show you how to get around. And they knew how to teach it. It was amazing, even for some lady from America trying to figure it out. They just felt, patient enough to try to show me that way, as opposed to, well, you can look at your map, but your map's going to be lousy out there. And it was, because they weren't detailed. But anyway, it was just part of also understanding that cultural landscape and what people are seeing out there and how different it is. But it's so important to capture. It is such a crucial part of who they are, and always will be, I hope. Anyway, there we go. See ya.